Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. I stand before you with both urgency and responsibility because something very significant has just occurred, and it will shape not only America's future, uh, but the future of the entire world. We are entering a moment that requires clear thinking, steady leadership, and above all, preparation. And I must warn you, ignoring this moment will come at a cost far greater than we can imagine. So let me ask you, are you prepared for what is unfolding right now? The global balance of power is no longer what it once was, and this is the shift that defines our era. For much of the past century, the United States held a position of unrivaled influence, setting the rules of the international order and shaping the institutions that guided the world economy and security frameworks. But today, that dominance is being challenged in ways that few could have imagined a generation ago. Nations that were once on the margins of global decision making are now asserting themselves with confidence. And new alliances are emerging that no longer rely on Washington's approval. This is not speculation. It is happening in real time, and the pace of change is accelerating. The question that should trouble every citizen is simple: what does this shift mean for America's future? Consider the rise of China, which is not just an economic competitor, but a nation actively crafting its own vision of global governance. Through initiatives like the Belt and Road, Beijing is building infrastructure, securing trade routes, and weaving a network of partnerships that extend across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Meanwhile, Russia, though often described in purely military terms, has positioned itself as a power broker in regions where the United States once called the shots. Add to this the growing influence of nations like India, Brazil, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, and what emerges is a multipolar world where America's word is no longer final. The shift is not about one rival or one alliance, but about the collective momentum of nations refusing to live under a USE-led system that they increasingly view as outdated and self-serving. We can already see the evidence of this transformation in the formation of economic blocs outside of Western structures. The expansion of BRI-CES is not just symbolic, it represents a coalition of countries seeking independence from the dollar-dominated system. Trade agreements are being written without Washington at the table, and new financial mechanisms are being developed that reduce reliance on U.S. banks or institutions like the IMF and World Bank. For decades, America relied on the dollar as a tool of both economic power and geopolitical leverage. But if that dominance is weakened, the United States will find itself losing one of its most potent instruments of influence. Ask yourself this: what happens when countries no longer need Washington to mediate their economic future? That day is closer than many assume. Another dimension of this shift is military strategy. While the United States has focused heavily on projecting its power abroad, stationing troops, building bases, and engaging in endless wars, other nations have invested in asymmetric capabilities that directly challenge U.S. superiority. From cyber warfare to advanced missile technology, rivals are demonstrating that Washington's traditional dominance on the battlefield can no longer be taken for granted. This reality is particularly stark in the Asia Pacific, where the U.S. Strategy of containment is being tested daily by China's assertiveness and the willingness of regional powers to align themselves in ways that suit their national interests rather than Washington's objectives. Uh, the hooks in this story are everywhere. Look at how Middle Eastern nations, long dependent on the United States for security guarantees, are now engaging directly with China and Russia, cutting deals without Washington's oversight. Look at Europe, where divisions are growing about whether following America's lead serves their economic and political interests. Look at Africa, where U.S. influence has waned dramatically as China pours billions into development projects that are reshaping the continent's infrastructure. These are not isolated developments. They are signs of a world shifting before our very eyes, and yet the American public remains largely unaware of how profound these changes are. This is why the warning cannot be ignored. The danger is not simply that America is losing influence, but that it is failing to adapt to the new reality. History shows us that great powers fall not only because they are challenged from abroad, but because they cling to illusions of supremacy long after the facts have changed. The United States risks repeating this mistake if it continues to believe that the world will wait for it to lead. The rise of other powers is not a temporary inconvenience. It is the defining feature of the 21st century. Those who prepare for this reality will shape the future. Those who deny it will be left behind. The question is whether America will recognize this shift in time, or whether, like so many empires before it, it will wake up only when the balance has already tipped beyond its control. Economic instability is no longer a distant threat that experts debate in closed rooms. It is a storm already brewing above us, with clouds gathering faster than policymakers are willing to admit. The illusion of stability that is often portrayed through stock market highs and employment figures hides a much deeper fragility. Beneath the surface lies a mountain of debt, a widening gap between rich and poor, and a system that is increasingly vulnerable to shocks. The United States has enjoyed decades of economic leadership, but the foundations of that strength are now being tested in ways that should alarm every household, every business, and every policymaker. The hooks are obvious if we care to see them: rising interest rates, staggering deficits, and a financial order that is slipping out of Washington's control. Consider first the burden of national debt. For years, Washington has borrowed recklessly, spending beyond its means with little regard for long-term consequences. Today, the U.S. debt has reached historic levels, surpassing the size of the entire economy itself. Servicing this debt alone costs hundreds of billions annually, and as interest rates climb, that burden only grows heavier. What happens when a government spends more on interest payments than on investments in education, infrastructure, or innovation? The answer is declining, because every dollar tied up in debt service is a dollar stolen from the nation's future. And yet, leaders continue to promise tax cuts and unchecked spending as though the bill will never come due. That illusion cannot last forever. The second fault line lies in inequality. For all the talk of growth and prosperity, the reality is that wealth has concentrated in the hands of a small elite while the majority of Americans struggle to make ends meet. The middle class, once the bedrock of stability, is shrinking as wages stagnate and costs for housing, healthcare, and education soar. Millions live paycheck to paycheck, vulnerable to the smallest economic disruption, while a small percentage enjoy record-breaking wealth. This is not merely unfair, it is dangerous. History shows us that societies built on extremes of wealth and poverty do not remain stable for long. The warning signs are already here: social unrest, political polarization, and a growing sense that the system is rigged against ordinary citizens. These are not isolated grievances. They are symptoms of an economic order that is failing to deliver for most of its people. Another hook lies in the financial markets themselves. For years, the Federal Reserve's policies of low interest rates and easy money fueled asset bubbles. From housing to stocks to cryptocurrency, investors rode the wave, but the fundamentals never supported such growth. Now, with inflation forcing higher rates, those bubbles are under pressure and cracks are showing. Banks are vulnerable, corporate bankruptcies are rising, and many households are trapped in debt they can no longer manage. If this sounds familiar, it should. It echoes the conditions that led to the 2008 financial crash. The danger this time is that the U.S. Has far less room to maneuver. With debt already sky high and political divisions paralyzing meaningful reform, the tools to fight another crisis are limited. We also cannot ignore the global dimension. For decades, America's economic dominance relied heavily on the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. But increasingly, nations are seeking alternatives. Major economies are conducting trade in their own currencies, building payment systems that bypass U.S. banks, and questioning why they should remain dependent on Washington's financial architecture. If confidence in the dollar weakens, the consequences will ripple across every American household. Prices will rise, imports will become more expensive, and the government's ability to fund its deficits cheaply will evaporate. It is not just a question of economics, it is a question of national security. The most pressing question is this: how many warning signs do we need before action is taken? Rising debt, deepening inequality, fragile markets, and declining global trust are not separate issues. They are interlinked parts of the same fragile structure. One tremor can trigger the collapse of the whole. Will it be a sudden market crash, a sovereign debt crisis, or a loss of global confidence in the dollar? No one knows which domino will fall first. But we know the chain reaction is coming. The American public has been lulled into believing that growth will always return, that the system will always bounce back. But history warns otherwise, and ignoring that lesson is the most dangerous gamble of all. For more than 2 decades, the United States has poured trillions of dollars into wars that promised security, but instead delivered instability, fatigue, awe, and a hollowing out of national strength. The narrative was always the same. Each intervention would bring peace, spread democracy, and protect American interests. Yet the reality is starkly different. These wars have left regions fractured, created humanitarian catastrophes, uh, and drained resources that could have been used to rebuild the very foundation of American prosperity. The hooks here are unmistakable, staggering costs, broken promises, and a public increasingly skeptical of the endless cycle of conflict. When we look at the costs of war, the numbers themselves tell a shocking story. Trillions of dollars have been spent on conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and beyond. That money was not invested in modern infrastructure, affordable healthcare, education, or renewable energy. It was burned in deserts and mountains thousands of miles away from home. Imagine how different America might look today if even a fraction of that spending had been directed toward repairing bridges, improving schools, or investing in cutting edge technologies. Instead, the war machine has consumed resources with little measurable return for the American people. Every dollar lost to endless wars is a dollar denied to future generations, and that is a bill no nation can afford indefinitely. The human cost is even greater. Countless lives have been lost, not only of American soldiers, but of civilians caught in the crossfire of wars that often had no clear objective or achievable end game. Generations of veterans have returned home carrying physical wounds and invisible scars, struggling with trauma and neglect in a system ill prepared to care for them. Entire societies in the Middle East and Central Asia have been destabilized, leaving power vacuums that bred extremism rather than eliminating it. The irony is sharp. Wars fought in the name of security have too often produced the very insecurity that they were meant to prevent. Beyond the financial and human toll lies the erosion of credibility. Around the world, America's interventions have been met with growing skepticism and resentment. Allies question Washington's judgment, while rivals exploit its overreach to expand their own influence. Think of how Russia and China have stepped into spaces once dominated by U.S. presence, not with armies, but with diplomacy, trade, and investment. While America has been bogged down in costly wars, other powers have been building infrastructure, negotiating agreements, and forging partnerships that reshape the global order. The battlefield is no longer the sole measure of influence, and by clinging to military dominance as the default strategy, the United States risks falling behind in the arenas that now matter most. The hooks become sharper when we consider how these wars affect ordinary citizens at home. Why are Americans facing crumbling roads, rising healthcare costs, and a public education system stretched to its limits while their tax dollars are funneled into conflicts abroad? Why are so many communities struggling with poverty and unemployment while defense contractors report record profits? These are not abstract policy debates. They are questions of priorities. And when the priorities of a nation are misaligned, its future becomes uncertain. Endless wars have turned into a hidden tax on the American people, one that most did not vote for, but all are forced to pay. Another layer of danger is the cycle of dependency these wars create. Once military engagements begin, they take on a life of their own, fueled by bureaucracies, lobbying interests, and political rhetoric that make withdrawal nearly impossible. Leaders speak of strategy and victory, yet the objectives constantly shift. Each new administration inherits unresolved conflicts and hesitates to take responsibility for ending them, fearing political backlash. And so the wars continue not because they serve the national interest, but because they have become embedded in the machinery of government itself. The warning could not be clearer. Wars fought without end weaken a nation from within. They drain its finances, sap its morale, and corrode its legitimacy abroad. The United States stands at a crossroads where it must decide whether to continue down a path of perpetual conflict or to reorient its power toward building, not destroying. The cost of failure is not abstract. It is lived every day by citizens who see their future sacrificed on the altar of endless war. And unless this cycle is broken, the nation risks repeating the same mistakes again and again until the weight of those choices becomes unbearable. Trust is the lifeblood of any functioning society, and once it begins to erode, the consequences ripple far beyond politics. In the United States today, public trust in institutions, government, media, justice, education, and even democracy itself is collapsing at an alarming pace. Citizens no longer believe their leaders are acting in their best interests. They doubt whether the news they read is truthful, whether elections are fair, or whether the justice system delivers equal protection under the law. This breakdown of trust is not a minor issue. It is a systemic crisis that undermines stability from within. And the hooks are everywhere, showing up in falling voter turnout, rising polarization, and the growing appetite for conspiracy theories as people seek answers outside the mainstream. Take the government itself, once viewed as the guardian of public welfare. Today, approval ratings for Congress hover at historic lows, while confidence in the executive branch swings wildly depending on partisan control. Citizens watch gridlock in Washington with frustration as lawmakers prioritize party victories over national solutions. Each shutdown, each failed negotiation, each headline about corruption or lobbying reinforces the perception that the system is broken and incapable of serving the people. When citizens conclude that their voices do not matter, they disengage, or worse, they turn to extremes. That disengagement weakens democracy itself, leaving it vulnerable to demagogues who exploit anger and mistrust for their own gain. The media, once considered a cornerstone of accountability, has also lost credibility with the rise of 24-hour news cycles. Sensationalism often takes precedence over substance. Outlets tailor coverage to partisan audiences, creating echo chambers where people hear only what confirms their existing beliefs. Meanwhile, misinformation spreads rapidly across social media platforms, eroding the very idea of a shared reality. When citizens cannot agree on basic facts, dialogue becomes impossible and division deepens. The hook here is painful but clear. When truth itself becomes contested, every institution that depends on truth begins to crumble. The justice system, too, faces a crisis of legitimacy. High-profile cases of unequal treatment, systemic bias, and selective accountability have fueled perceptions that justice in America is not blind, but deeply partisan and unequal. Whether it is seen in the treatment of political leaders, the wealth gap in legal outcomes, or the disparities in sentencing, many Americans believe that the law protects the powerful while punishing the weak. This perception, fair or not, is corrosive. When people lose faith in the fairness of the courts, they lose faith in the rule of law, and without the rule of law, a society teeters on the edge of instability. Education, once the great equalizer, has also fallen under suspicion. Schools are battlegrounds for ideological debates, funding crises, and declining standards. Parents question what their children are being taught, while young people increasingly doubt that education will lead to opportunity in an economy marked by inequality and automation. If the next generation grows up believing the system cannot provide them with a future, then the very foundation of national renewal is in jeopardy. The hook here is generational. A country that loses the trust of its youth risks losing its future entirely. Even democracy itself, the idea that citizens can shape their destiny through free and fair elections, is under question. Allegations of voter suppression, foreign interference, gerrymandering, and mistrust in electoral systems have left millions doubting whether their vote truly counts. This doubt, whether rooted in fact or perception, is a poison that eats away at the legitimacy of government. Democracies do not collapse only when they are overthrown. They collapse when citizens no longer believe they work. The seeds of that collapse are already visible in the cynicism and disengagement of the American public. The most unsettling aspect of this collapse of trust is how it feeds on itself. Once citizens begin doubting one institution, they begin doubting all of them, creating a cycle of cynicism that is difficult to break. Distrust in government leads to distrust in media. Distrust in media leads to distrust in elections. And soon a society is left questioning the very foundations of its order. The danger is not just that people are angry, it is that they no longer believe reform is possible. And when reform seems impossible, the temptation grows to tear down the system altogether, regardless of what might replace it. That is the true warning. When trust collapses, the center cannot hold, and the cracks that appear in a nation's institutions quickly spread to the nation itself. The environmental crisis is no longer a distant warning on the horizon. It is here, it is visible, and it is shaping our lives in ways we can no longer deny. Rising temperatures, record-breaking heat waves, devastating wildfires, destructive hurricanes, and catastrophic floods are no longer rare events. They are becoming the norm. Each year, we see communities torn apart, livelihoods destroyed, and billions of dollars in damages piling up. But yet the response from political leaders remains dangerously inadequate. The hooks are all around us, from farmers watching their crops wither under extreme drought to families forced from their homes by floods to cities choking under polluted air. These are not abstract projections of the future. They are the lived realities of millions right now. What makes this crisis especially dangerous is its intersection with every other challenge facing society. Climate change is not an isolated environmental issue. It is a multiplier that exacerbates economic instability, fuels political tensions, and magnifies inequality. When floods destroy homes, the poor suffer most. When food prices rise because of crop failures, struggling families are the hardest hit. When water becomes scarce, tensions between nations escalate into conflicts. This is why ignoring the environmental crisis is not just short-sighted, it is reckless. The failure to act decisively today ensures that tomorrow's problems will be far more severe and unmanageable. The economic costs alone should be enough to jolt leaders into action. Every major disaster now carries a price tag in the tens or hundreds of billions. Insurance systems are straining under the weight of repeated claims. Governments are borrowing more to rebuild destroyed infrastructure, and private businesses are facing disruptions to supply chains caused by extreme weather events. Think of the lost productivity when factories shut down, when ports close, when millions are displaced from their homes. The environmental crisis is not only about nature, it is about the financial foundation of society itself. The question is simple but urgent. How long can an economy thrive when it is constantly paying the price of inaction? The scientific consensus has been clear for decades, yet political will continues to falter. Leaders make lofty promises at international conferences, but emissions continue to rise, forests continue to be destroyed, and fossil fuel consumption remains stubbornly high. Citizens are left with a bitter realization that their governments are more beholden to short-term interests and corporate lobbying than to the survival of the planet. The hook here is painfully obvious. Future generations will judge us not by our rhetoric, but by our actions. And right now, the gap between the two is widening at a dangerous pace. Another dimension of the crisis is the way it reshapes global security. As sea levels rise, entire populations are forced to migrate, creating waves of displacement that strain borders and fuel political instability. Already, we are witnessing climate refugees fleeing unlivable conditions, and the numbers are set to grow exponentially. A scarcity of water and arable land sparks conflict in regions already under stress, and nations are beginning to recognize that climate change is as much a threat to security as any conventional weapon. The irony is striking. While trillions are spent on wars abroad, the true existential threat, climate, receives a fraction of that investment. What happens when rising seas swallow coastal cities, when deserts expand, when storms intensify? These are not science fiction scenarios. They are certainties unless decisive change is made. The hooks cut deeper when we look at the moral dimension. What does it mean for a wealthy nation to continue polluting while poorer nations bear the brunt of the damage? How can leaders justify policies that protect fossil fuel industries while ignoring the voices of young people demanding a livable future? There is a growing sense, especially among the youth, that they are being robbed of tomorrow by the greed and negligence of today. That anger is not going away. It is growing. and it will reshape politics in ways leaders are not yet prepared for. The reality is stark. The climate crisis is the defining challenge of this century. Unlike wars or economic downturns, it cannot be negotiated away, postponed, or ignored without consequence. Nature does not wait for political convenience. The storms will come, the heat will rise, the seas will advance, whether leaders acknowledge them or not. And yet, within this challenge lies a choice: continue down the path of destruction or seize the opportunity to build a new, sustainable future. The warning signs are everywhere, but so too are the solutions: renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, green infrastructure. The hooks are not only about the dangers we face, but also the possibilities we are ignoring. The clock is ticking, and history will remember whether we rose to the moment or let it slip through our hands. Preparation is no longer a choice, it is a necessity. The great challenge of our time is not simply recognizing the crises unfolding around us, but responding to them with clarity, urgency, and resolve. Something significant has already shifted in the global order, the economy, our environment, and in the very trust that holds societies together. The question is whether America and the world at large will use this moment as a wake-up call, or whether they will allow complacency and denial to push them further into decline. The hooks here are undeniable. Nations either prepare to adapt and rebuild, or they watch as history passes them by. Preparation begins with honesty. For too long, leaders have sold illusions of stability, pretending that old formulas and slogans will be enough to manage today's challenges. But the reality is that the world has changed in fundamental ways. Economic growth cannot be sustained through debt and consumption alone. Security cannot be achieved through endless wars. Prosperity cannot endure while the planet itself is destabilized. If we continue clinging to myths instead of facts, then no amount of political spin will save us when the consequences arrive. A serious course correction begins by telling people the truth, even if that truth is uncomfortable. Rebuilding requires investment not in military dominance or corporate bailouts, but in the resilience of society itself. Imagine what could be achieved if the trillions spent on wars and reckless tax cuts were redirected toward sustainable infrastructure, advanced education, affordable health care, and cutting edge technologies. A nation's strength does not come from its ability to project force abroad, but from the well-being of its citizens at home. Preparedness means building systems that can withstand shocks, whether those shocks come from financial markets, pandemics, climate disasters, or geopolitical rivalries. The future will not reward those who are strongest in arms. It will reward those who are strongest in adaptability. The hooks become sharper when we look at what this means for ordinary citizens. People are asking, how do we prepare for a world where jobs are disrupted by automation, where the cost of living continues to rise, and where climate events can upend lives overnight? Preparation cannot be left solely to governments. It must also become a cultural mindset. Citizens need access to education that equips them for a changing economy. Communities need investments that make them resilient against disasters, and societies need leaders who plan not for the next election cycle, but for the next generation. The ability to anticipate, adapt, and innovate will determine whether people thrive or fall behind in this era of rapid change. A critical part of rebuilding is restoring trust. Without trust in institutions, no reform can succeed because citizens will always suspect betrayal or incompetence. That means transparency in governance, accountability for corruption, and a media that informs rather than inflames. Trust is not built overnight, but it can be rebuilt step by step when leaders act with integrity and deliver on promises. Preparing for the future is not only about policies and budgets, it is about repairing the relationship between citizens and the institutions meant to serve them. If that bond is not restored, even the best policies will collapse under the weight of cynicism. The international dimension of preparation is equally vital. America can no longer dictate terms to the world, but it can still lead by example. Rebuilding credibility means engaging in diplomacy rather than domination, cooperation rather than coercion. The challenges of climate, pandemics, financial stability, and technological disruption are global in nature and cannot be solved by one nation acting alone. Preparation in this century must mean building alliances based not on military might, but on shared survival and shared progress. The hook here is clear. Either nations learn to cooperate or they will all face decline together. At its core, preparation is about courage, the courage to admit mistakes, to break with failing habits, and to embrace new ways of thinking. Rebuilding is about vision, the ability to see beyond the immediate crisis and chart a path toward a future that is not only survivable, but prosperous. The wake up call has already sounded. The cracks in the system are visible. The big event has already happened. The illusion of permanent stability has been shattered. What remains to be seen is whether leaders and citizens alike have the wisdom to act before it is too late. The hooks are all around us, pulling at our conscience. Will we rise to the challenge of rebuilding, or will we watch passively as decline accelerates? The choice, as always in history, belongs to us.